Hey folks, welcome to Between Awesome and Disaster. This is your host, Will Carey. I appreciate you tuning in. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're healthy, happy, and taking care of those closest to you. I am feeling pretty good for a lot of different reasons. The news that Japan is reopening a little bit, as I'm sure you know, listeners know I loved my time that I've spent there and want to go back again. So that is very exciting. My friend Cindy just had a birthday, and we did an escape room, and we won. So I'm now 1 for 2 in solving escape rooms. That was a very thrilling experience, I must say. As someone who's only done a couple, but that was pretty excellent. I'm recording this on the cusp of Labor Day weekend, but today's episode is I'm very excited to share this episode with you. So thank you guys again so much for being here, especially if this is your first time, because my guest on the show today is Kris Roe. Kris Roe is the brainchild, the lead vocalist and guitarist for the band The Ataris, who have been one of my favorite bands since I was in high school. When I was in my formative, when I was becoming when the foundation was being set for the person that I would become. Early 2000s pop punk and melodic punk rock was a big part of that for me, as well as my friends in my friends at the Patuxent High Harlequins at Patuxent High School. And one of the seminal albums of that era for me that I think still holds up tremendously is So Long Astoria by the Ataris. I remember hearing In This Diary on probably MTV2, and then really enjoying it, and then going back and finding all of their Kung Fu Records albums, such as Blue Skies, Broken Hearts, Next 12 Exits, End Is Forever, all of those great independent pop punk albums that they put out. And this was right before the cover of Boys of Summer started getting played everywhere on the radio, and Kris and I do talk about that a little bit. But I've been a fan for a long time, and as someone who's as someone who really who's fortunate enough to have this podcast to be able to afford the medium by which I can reach out to these people that meant and tell them how much their work has meant to me. This was a really exciting episode that Kris and I talk a lot about those early days, especially coming from a small town in Indiana to his time when he was effectively living in his van in Santa Barbara, all the way through the Ataris' breakthrough mainstream success to where they are now, where he's continuing to work on new music. I also want to let you guys know, starting October, Kris is going to be on the Tried and True tour, which is going to be hitting lots of cities in the United States, particularly Lower 48. He's going to be doing acoustic sets opening for Alien Ant Farm, Lit, and Hoobastank. Again, all bands that were very important to my musical development when I was younger, and it's especially cool to hear Lit because I've my own worst enemy is in the Clerks 3 trailer, so that's been pretty cool. But I'm very excited to share my conversation with you. My conversation with Kris Roe with you today. He's been through a lot the last few years, especially during the pandemic. But I'm really happy that he's still here, still inspired, and I look forward to hearing new stuff from him. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to listen to more, I have probably got an interview with one of your favorite bands, or if you are in one of my favorite bands, I would love to have you on. You can reach out to me at awesomedisaster.com. That is awesomedisaster.com. You can shoot me a message. Links to everything related to me is there. So let's get into it and talk to Kris Roe from the Ataris. I got to thinking when we were setting this up, because it's earlier where you are, I started thinking about, our younger like punk rock selves and like how we would feel like now that we're like getting older. And I started thinking outside of like becoming morning people, I also think for musicians, there's an age. Like if you're a guitarist, I think there's an age where you just get issued a Telecaster and then that's the identity.
Well, for me, I started out playing a Telecaster after recording our first record, Anywhere But Here, because I always really loved like kind of vintage, kind of natural, organic sounds. Like before I got into like melodic punk rock, like before I discovered the Descendants and Sam I Am and Jawbreaker, I was more a fan of like Dinosaur Jr. and Sonic Youth and all those bands, and they all played like Jazzmaster and But for me as a player at like 13, I couldn't play as good as like Jay Mascis or Thurston Moore.
Yeah.
But when I discovered like the album by All Roy's Revenge, even though those guys are gnarly players, the melodic side of that and like the songs about relationships and love and things really spoke to that youthful kid of me. But then now, as you say, as you grow up and one thing I do agree that's kind of what you're saying is like a few years back, well, actually like 4 years back, I got in this really bad car accident with this driver of a high-speed chase in Los Angeles who was being chased by police officers, came around the corner and hit me head on. One amazing thing that did come out of that, other than not dying, was that the new van I got only had a CD player in it, and I was just too lazy to get a new stereo in it, and so I just deep dived into all these great old jazz records, and now because of that, at 45, like I'm like the biggest fan of just like all these old jazz greats like Coltrane and of course Miles, but like Mingus and there's just so many amazing Sonny Rollins. Like but yeah, it really like opened up this whole like window of music that I was always a casual listener. Like when I turn on like the station that's NPR, like at night, there it's usually a jazz station. I'd be like into things, but yeah, that was so that's like my equivalent of the Telecaster thing, I guess. It's like suddenly I've noticed a lot of like punk people, like even the Descendants and the Black Flag guys, like they were the biggest fans of jazz, and there's a whole interview I found of Greg Ginn from Black Flag just talking about how he grew up. I don't remember the relation, but either they lived next door to this jazz club in Hermosa Beach, and he just got, as a young kid, he just got to go see all these like amazing players. But anyway, yeah. But the Telecasters, like that's what I play, and that's like my favorite tones anyway. Like old '60s amps, and like always recording vintage analog gear. It's like but at some point in like the 2000s, I just switched to a Les Paul. I think generally because a lot of the times when we would play shows and they would have hired gear, a single coil pickup of a Telecaster, we just plug in and play on like a Marshall is usually not enough gain, and through my amp it sounds fabulous. But yeah, so with a Les Paul, you plug in and play, it's just AC/DC. You can't go wrong. It's just humbuckers. But anyway, yeah.
I hear you, man. Like especially like I find myself appreciating lots of like Americana kind of singer-songwriters nowadays. Like I love that kind of stuff. Like I see like the parallels, and I've talked to lots of people lately also, and this is kind of 16-year-old me would have never seen this connection, but like the punks and country pipeline is like a very real pipeline, because that music is all like three chords and the truth. And then especially like even if you get into like the more like poppy stuff that's like on the radio, it's like friends and beer, and lots of punk is friends and beer.
I think, with anything, even with the pop stuff, if you wade through, I just try to find something, like some redeeming quality in everything. Like, I think that's another thing of, like, growing older is that, like, I always kind of go back and try to revisit artists or albums or genres of music that I kind of maybe as a kid wrote off, but yeah, you're right. Like, as a singer-songwriter and somebody who likes to tell these kind of Midwestern stories of, like, the crumbling factories and the way of, the things I would see when I would drive through my town growing up. Like every year it gets worse. You go back and visit in small town Indiana where I grew up, and it looks more and more like some dystopia novel. It's really things of those writers' songs. But yeah, I do love like modern country too, but it has to be like good songwriting. Like I saw George Strait live, and I think he was one of the best performers I've ever seen, and just so many hits and so many good songs, and like I think that's actually, that was kind of my gateway. Like I was in, I mean, I loved all like, the singer-songwriters, from the 50s and the 60s. But, of course, like Waylon and Hank Sr. and Merle Haggard and all those people. And then, of course, Patsy Cline and Kitty Wells and all that. But as far as modern country, I remember being at a truck stop, and I kind of actually strangely wrote this line. This when I say the line in this diary, it's like about truck stops. I'm
hanging out at truck stops
Yeah,
just
yeah.
to pass the time. Yeah.
In my mind, I am at a truck stop in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we stopped. We just pulled the tour bus on Warped Tour, pulled in there, and I just remember walking into this like Flying J or Pilot in the middle of the night, and there's just like this feeling of like being out of the road and young and free, and it was such a great feeling. And I just remember hearing the song by George Strait on the PA in the place, the song "I Can Still Make Cheyenne," and I'm like, this is just so surreal. It's like, he's talking about being like this guy out on the road, rodeo guy, going from town to town, and like just that typical story of like the things you lost and left behind for this life that you chose. And it just really struck me. And I'm like, and so when I wrote that line, that's like what is in my head when I wrote it. But no one would know that unless you explain what's going on there. But but yeah, that's like a bit of depth into that. But definitely the country thing for sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's like so beautifully poetic, dude. To talk about like gateways a little bit. So my the drummer in my old band that I played in high school like messaged me on Facebook recently, and the only link I got, he sent me the Spotify link to In This Diary. Is like, this song came on and it reminded me of you, because I had that album on in my like green Ford Focus in high school all the time. That album was like heavy in the rotation. And I specifically remember another memory of mine tied to that music. I think there was like a year when like I found myself. I heard Blink for the first time and I was like, got it. My friend convinced me to do a school play, and like my whole life was set in that time. And I remember like my first couple years of playing guitar, sitting in my room, and I was like just figuring out power chords. And the first song I like sat down and learned how to play all the way through was My Reply.
Oh wow, awesome! I'm very honored. Thanks. It's always really surreal for me as a big fan of so many artists myself to hear when people say something like, "Yeah, like something you wrote helped me learn an instrument." It's like it's hard to wrap my head around it, because to me, in my mind, I'm just a big nerdy fan of so many other things. So to put yourself out of that and like third person about your own thing you created, it's like the most humbling and the thing that's like kept me enjoying what I do and loving what I do. So I mean, I really do appreciate that. It's surreal, but that's cool. Because I remember being 13 and like having artists that did that for me. So it's like, it's so strange. I think the funniest one I got, just to tell you, is, no, I don't even know if I should tell it. But like, so, yeah, there's been some funny ones, but yeah, somebody said that like they did. Like, oh yeah, I don't know why they would just like, word vomit. Like, obviously, like, first time I ever did this thing was listening to your music. I'm like, that's kind of weird, but okay. Fill in the blank. You can imagine.
Did somebody? Yeah. I think I got you.
Yeah, it was really weird.
I know what you're putting on.
I've had some strange encounters, but I mean, I was like, oh, thanks. Like, what do you say to that? Or like my buddy Tuck from this band, The Biters from Atlanta. He's a really great songwriter and a good all-around human, but he's really funny. All these funny anecdotes. He's like, man, and I gotta do the Tuck voice when I say it, when I talk about him. But he's like, man, dude, he really to set the scene, they're kind of like a Bowie, New York Doll, just like good, amazing, but power pop too, but really melodic songs. Like his new art thing was set to open that Crew stadium tour, but then the pandemic happened, and then they were going to be right below Joan Jett as like the band playing when the cheap seats fill in. But his old band, the Biters, were super great, just good rock and roll in the sense of like glam 70s. They look like the Ramones, or like somebody just rolled out of bed, but they still look so cool. And Tuck told me this story one time. He's like, man, y'all played in Atlanta at the Masquerade. And he's like, and I remember he either said he got kicked out or he showed up and couldn't get in. And he's like, and then I ended up getting laid outside, parked in front of the Masquerade with his first girlfriend, listening to Endless Forever while we played inside, or something like that. It's like, that is the funniest shit I've ever heard. And it's so him, if you knew him, to hear that story. But yeah, the Biters, good band. I think it's fun. But anyway, I digress.
That's gnarly, man. So to kind of trace like your timeline here, so talking about like the crumbling of the Midwest. So I know like a part of your story starts in Santa Barbara, but you originally are from Anderson, Indiana, like small town
Correct.
Indiana. Yeah.
I moved to Santa Barbara in 1997. I just had a kid. I tried, in '96. Tried my best to make that work as much as I can. Just wanted to try and step up and be a good father. As a child myself, I did all I could. But I think the sad part of that story is that trying to build a family around a relationship that was already had its foundation crumbling. It came to like, hey, I tried my best, but ultimately I was presented this opportunity where I would rewind a tiny bit. I would give my demos to bands that I would go see at all the shows in Chicago, Cincinnati. Mostly is where we'd go to shows because 21 and over was mostly Indianapolis at that time. They didn't really have any all ages scene. So I gave my demo tape, specifically the show that kind of led to my path in life. I went and saw the Queers, Mr. T Experience, and I forgot who else. But the band The Vandals was playing as well. I didn't even really listen to the Vandals much at the time, but my friend who did, I was more into like melodic stuff, and when it came to that world of punk rock, and so like the Lookout bands, early first two Green Day albums, Sam I Am, Jawbreaker, and so I was there and. My friend's like, hey, the Vandals are starting to label. Give me one of your demo tapes and I'll give it to them. I'm like, sure. And so he did. And then fast forward several months, and they I guess there was only a phone number in the tape, or yeah, and it was disconnected. And then they found like a PO box for me, and they sent me a letter and said they'd like call them. They want to put out the demo, and I thought it was a joke. And so we got on the phone, and I thought it was somebody like playing a prank, but it turned out to be true. They're like, hey, I explained to them. This is all me and my drum machine on the demo. Like I program all the parts, I write all the drums, I play all the instruments. They're like, well, what if we hooked you up with a drummer? We'd fly you out to California and you could record your record, all these songs. We really believe in the songs. I'm like, I'd be honored. So anyway, I got that opportunity. So in the end, after I recorded the record, I went back to Indiana. But while I was in California, the drummer I played with, his name was Derek. He was the original drummer in that band Lagwagon. But as somebody who knew of that band, and in the small world of punk rock and other bands we had met, I did know that Derek struggled with a heroin addiction. There was not internet at that time, so it wasn't like you could Google somebody or what have you. But I did know. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was fairness. There was like dial-up internet, but it was it was pretty primitive. So you didn't know these things, but word got around, and so when I was recording with them, there were just a lot of issues and problems, and it was. He was a great talent, and he had so many good traits, but unfortunately, he was succumbing to this addiction. So when I got back to Indiana, I'm like, well, I got to record a record. So I thought that was the end of that. But it turned out eventually, months later, after talking to the label more, they're like, they believed in the songs. They're like, you should come out to California, and then I kind of got out there, and I kind of put the band together and started actually playing shows and just built it up from the ground up. And we kind of became the Ataris from Santa Barbara, because that's really, we'd only played a handful of live shows when I lived in Indiana. Once I got to Santa Barbara and I really kind of put a new band together. I mean, I played a few shows with Derek playing drums, but it was evident that wasn't going to work because of his addiction, and so we parted ways. And then I put together the live lineup that ended up being with Mike Davenport, who played bass on in the band, the live lineup of So Long Astoria, and then the drummer Chris Knapp, who played drums on So Long Astoria, and then we had a few changes of guitars, but ultimately, that was how it kind of started.
Yeah, and that was kind of like the core for those Kung Fu Records albums. Because I remember, like, after like I started doing my deep dive into your discography, and got like Blue Skies, Broken Hearts. That was another like seminal one for me. Of course, Sindemus High School Football rules.
I find there's like two entry points for people. It's usually So Long Astoria or Blue Skies. It seems to be the entry points into the Atari.
So like coming out of trying to like basically like get this band together, like just like, oh my God, I have this opportunity, and then kind of trying to like get it together, I can imagine I imagine that was like a pretty gnarly and exciting time for sure.
Yeah, I always kind of felt like, for me, the struggle and the climb is like the best part. even still to this day, like I never want to get too comfortable. I always like to feel like I have a goal. I mean, as a Capricorn, I'm just a very goal-driven person. Like, 2020, I left for tour in March of 2020, got to Indiana to visit my mom before the tour was supposed to happen. Then, of course, COVID happened. The entire tour got canceled. And then after 2 days, I got COVID, was sick for 5 weeks, ended up in the hospital, and almost died. That was the most traumatizing, hard year I've ever gone through my entire life for a few reasons. And even through all those hard struggles, in the back of my mind, I'm like, I've just got to keep pushing forward and believe that, there's something good that's going to come out of this and something better. That's just like the optimist in me. I can definitely be really bleak sometimes and gray, but I mean, that's just, that comes with all the music I love. But ultimately, yeah, even in those times in Santa Barbara when I first moved there, I was homeless. I was living in my van. There was a homeless shelter in Santa Barbara, but they only have 9 beds. So it's not like a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco where you can easily be homeless and there's like soup kitchens and things, like I was literally just like, I moved out there with my van and a suitcase full of things. And, I would just try to like scrounge money to eat. And I slept in the rehearsal space that Derek had for a while, but got kicked out of there because the owner realized he had some drug paraphernalia in there. And so then I ended up sleeping in my van. And then the van got impounded because Santa Barbara is very anti-unhoused population community. It's a wonderful town, but it's also very affluent. So when they see someone parked in a van outside of a nice neighborhood, they always, they're scoping it out. And so, yeah, it was a rough time. But like you said, even through all of that, the goals and the dream I had really kind of kept me going, and it paid off. Even those times when we would play for 5 people, I was having the time of my life just as much as when I played for 5,000 people. In fact, sometimes those small shows are some of the best memories, but it's really personal, very like there's a connection that you get with a crowd. Like those are the shows I love to go to when you're like, right there and the singer's putting the mic in your face, and like that sort of chaotic beauty of like a room full of people that feels very familial, very like you're all there together on the same wavelength. I like that a lot. That's my favorite thing.
Oh yes. Oh my God, certainly. Like I'm just so happy to be able to be going and playing shows again. That's like the thing I think I missed the most in the last couple of years is not being able to go and see live performance.
Yeah, I haven't. I'm still a very even in a normal year, I was a very cautious person when it came to certain things. Like I'm a bit like neurotic, but with the pandemic and almost dying, it really, it being that this is an airborne virus, and I got infected another time. The 2 times I got infected, it was literally 20 minutes being around another human, and ever since then, I realized that. It's been really hard for me to find a way to dip my toes back in, and it's like, how can I safely do the thing that I love, that like is my lifeline, but do it in a way that feels safe and comfortable to me, and also isn't going to put anyone who's like disabled or immune compromised at risk. So like that was my hardest thing. But I mean, the first thing I accepted was this will be the first shows I've played since 2019. Is these acoustic shows I'm opening for Alien Ant Farm, Lit, and Hoobastank. They just sent an offer for this tour, and I was like, oh, this is like half outdoor shows, and the rest are really massive theaters. It's me opening. I can drive myself, so I can kind of set my own mitigations, and I'll mask everywhere, and then just go play my 20 minutes, and then leave. So it was the first thing where I'm like, all right, I'm going to try this. And if I can do this safely, then I'll do the next thing. Like we have an offer to do 2 shows with the band in a big market overseas. And I'm like, all right, this is like a whole other level. This is like for me to do this now in the current world, it's like a big step. So it's like baby steps. But yeah, I respect people who are doing it. But like after what I went through, like I said, I had COVID twice. Each time was 5 weeks. And the first time I ended up in the hospital and almost didn't make it. I've had 4 friends lose a parent. I lost my great aunt.
Oh my God!
And it was a fucked couple years. But I mean, hey, there's a lot of good that came out of it. But yeah, it's definitely hard when your profession is you've got to go in a room full of screaming, sweaty, maskless people that are like shouting right in your face. So it's like, because I love that in a normal time, but in this time, it's just like, well, that's the thing that's going to make me get sick again, and also maybe make us have to cancel the tour, because the bands that don't believe in the science, you got to assume they're going to get out on the road. And I see like every other day on my Facebook, 5 shows into the tour, a band has to cancel 10 dates because somebody in their camp tests positive. So it's a weird new reality. Anyway, long story short, yeah, I'm definitely dipping my toes back in and trying to do it as safely as possible. But I'm glad that some people, are getting to do things that they love again. I mean, I'm slowly doing that. I've done a couple things, but I've still not gone to a show since the last show we played with MXPX in November 2019. That was the last show I've been to. I would have been to 100 shows between now and then, but it was a traumatic experience, almost dying. It was pretty fucked.
I can imagine. I had no idea you had like 2 really bad cases like that. I'm glad you're still here, man. That sounds awful.
It was no good, but yeah, man. I'm excited to try and play some shows again. It's definitely the thing I love the most, and I think it'll be good. So fingers crossed it goes well and nothing has to cancel or nobody gets sick. It'll be good.
That's a cool lineup too, like Lit and Hoobastank with Alien the Arm. That's like, I was into all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good tour. Yeah, I mean, I generally find like the bands I listen to are generally like bands that we like. A lot of the times are bands that I probably won't get to play with because it's outside of the world of music we play with. But it's always cool when I get on a package of bands that are genuinely good people and genuinely bands that have great followings of their own. And I think it works with the Ataris. The venues are cool too. Like, there's a couple of venues in Texas, and one's like this really cool outdoor thing where they do like, I don't know, like good like Americana shows and stuff. It's like it's really cool. Some have cool vibes. So yeah, I dig all that. Like, and just also being out on the road and like, I do photography, so I get to take some photos. There's a lot of days off. I guess the way they spaced it out, I think because maybe Hoobastank or one of those bands has some festival dates on a couple of the off days. And I think also maybe because of COVID, they just spaced the shows out a little more. I mean, I've seen a lot of bands will do like chunks of shows. That way, they can break it up. So anyway, that leaves me to have a lot of days off. And being that it's just me traveling in my car, I have like very little expenses. I can just go out and just, be on the road and see the scenery and kind of, be isolated in a good way, listen to music and podcasts and what have you, and audiobooks.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it's a much different approach to touring from like I imagine the early like DIY days when I don't know if you use like Book Your Own Fucking Life in the early Kung Fu Records days.
I did, yeah. In fact, if you go back, I think in a couple of them there are ads for the Ataris that I put when I had my demo tape that I gave the Vandals. There's ads that I put in Book Your Own Fucking Life because I would read Maximum Rock and Roll like religiously. So that and Flipside, yeah. That's how I mail ordered a lot of albums pre-internet. Through the back classifieds of those.
Amazing. That's awesome, dude. Yeah, because like based from what I've heard, that was like the Bible for how to be in a band and do it yourself if you didn't want to like wait around for a label to do it for you.
Totally.
So let me ask you a little bit about kind of the transition into how So Long Astoria came to be. So you did these albums on Kung Fu Records, and then you're doing these DIY tours. And then how does like Columbia and the major label debut come into play?
Around the time of Blue Skies, our second album, this was at the time where like, Green Day and Bad Religion and The Offspring and all those bands had broke, and now we were kind of on to like the second wave of like melodic punk bands were starting to get signed and or were blowing up. So I think we were one of those bands, but they saw we kind of build up this grassroots following, and and so we started meeting with some labels around that time. But we had one more album that we owed to Kung Fu, and my whole thought was like, look, I'm a very DIY mindset. That's how I came up, and the bands I respected, that's the way they did it. So I don't really feel like jumping the gun on our second album and going to this major label, or going to a major label would be something that I feel comfortable with. I'd much rather do one more album and complete our contract in Kung Fu and see where we're at then. And so we did Indus Forever, and by that time, we were outselling everything on Kung Fu. There was not really another band on the label that could like add name weight that we needed. So because, if we were on a label with other bands that were like really big, other than the Vandals, and then they had like a demo of like Blink's album, and that, you know, the other bands, they didn't really give any clout or power to them when it came to like trying to help us. Like, you know, if they had like other bands to kind of use that as leverage, is what I'm trying to say, it would have really helped. At the time, we were kind of tearing the label, and, you know, I owe everything to Kung Fu, and we were grateful. I'm still friends with Joe, and you know, definitely that you know, I owe so much to them. But at that time, you know, they knew and we knew that we needed to kind of continue growing organically. So we met with some other labels, and the thing I think a lot of people don't even know, like it was the major label thing for me. You know, we had some offers that were like, fuck you money. And then we had an offer from Columbia that was a modest deal, but they were like, we will give you all creative control so you can continue to build this thing like you do it. And that was most important to me. And my friend Glenn from the band Toad the Wet Sprocket from Santa Barbara, this great 90s alternative radio band, he told me that he had a great experience on the label. The A&R guy we had met was a really genuine person, and I got nothing but good vibes, and I have nothing but good things to say. I think the only thing that out of that experience that was kind of annoying was that we were going to film our second video. Our first single was In This Diary, and our second single was supposed to be My Reply. We already had a treatment for the video. We were going to film it, and then the radio person at Columbia, who is going to another label, or he was going to get promoted or something, he decided that he would go without our approval and take Boys of Summer from the record and shop that to K-Rock in LA, the big radio station, and say, hey, this was already a hit for Henley and Mike Campbell. You should just go ahead and this will be their next single. And I thought that, I was like, can they do that? But I was naive in hindsight. Of course they can do that. But I think everybody that worked with us didn't think that was the right idea, because obviously I think all we worked for was building up this band about the songwriting, and not that's an amazing song. The reason I covered it was because my grandmother on my father's side, who had passed away, it was a song that reminded me of being down there with her and visiting her on holidays in Florida. And when she died, it was kind of a song I covered in tribute to her. So it had meaning, but I didn't really want a cover to be our single. But I'm not. I mean, hey, you know, it opened the door to a lot of people who probably would have never discovered our band outside of that world that we built. But I do feel a handful of those people that grew with us from the days of, you know, Blue Skies were turned off by that. I mean, yeah, whatever. I was the kid that, I remember when Green Day, I loved that band when Kerplunk came out. And I remember when they signed and put out Dookie, I was a little shithead 13-year-old that was like, man, that's my band. But that was different, I feel, because at that time, there was no kind of nothing to compare that to. That was like the year, you know, that kind of thing. They bought up the indie scene of Lookout and Epitaph, and you know. But it's, you know, I didn't think there was anything bad going on a major label, but I definitely wish that because that Boys of Summer being the second single, Boys of Summer was still being played on the radio by the time winter rolled around. So when we went to radio with the song The Saddest Song for our third single, The Saddest Song never really got played much, because they're like, the way radio works, they're like, we already have one song by the Ataris in rotation. We're not going to have two, because that takes up, you know, 5 minutes of time where we could play like something from like a classic album like Nevermind, or you know, another track by one of these like icon bands, which I get because they're selling advertising. But so why have two songs for my newer band? So so that was kind of a bummer. But, you know, the fact that we had 3 singles to talk about at all is still something I'm very proud of and amazing. And the fact that we were able to, you know, reach so many people, I have no regrets, and I wouldn't change anything. But that is one thing, and I'm like, yeah, that was at the time something that annoyed me. And as a very outspoken person, I tend to just kind of fight that in a way where it's very. I grew up in that world where, you know, you do what you want, and if you believe in your vision, you just continue doing it. So I think at that time, you know, like when we heard that, I remember we were on stage at a big radio festival for K-Rock on the West Coast, and they're like, hey, they just added Boys of Summer as a single. So, you guys going to play that song today, right? They asked us. I'm like, the band doesn't know that song. I generally record all the instruments except for the drums. So it was a thing where we get time to tour, and I'd be like, okay, what songs do we want to play live? And then I would show the band the songs that that we were going to play. And so I'm like, they never played that song other than the drummer. I had to show him the song backstage. And I just remember I had a Pedro the Lion shirt on, and I turned it inside out, and I just, as a joke, I wrote, "Who the fuck is Don Henley?" as a joke. Because I love Henley's songwriting, and Mike Campbell, Tom Petty's guitar player, music. I love both of them. But it was just as a joke. And of course, that day, Rolling Stone was there and took a fucking photo of me wearing this. And then Henley's management saw it, who, luckily enough, was our manager at the time used to work for. And they were like, "You'll never play that song ever again." Not Henley, but his management. And luckily, we talked to Henley, and he was cool about it. But it was one of those things where it was just like, it was me just kind of like fucking with everybody, and just kind of, I grew up in that world where you build something, you're proud of it, and you fight against that kind of thing. And at the time I did, but in hindsight, it's like, whatever. It is what it is.
Yeah, there were certainly some benefits to that, but I could definitely see, like, if you had, because I remember reading that My Reply was going to be the new single and thinking, oh, that's a great choice. That because I remember having had that album and then started hearing Boys of Summer on the radio all the time. If I could say one thing, I am definitely one of those fans that benefited from the major label thing, because I might not have ever heard of Kung Fu Records otherwise, based on where I was.
I have those things for me too. I mean, remember, like you said, I'm from Anderson, Indiana, pre-internet days. The way we would discover music were mainstream outlets. For me, it was the TV program on MTV every Sunday night at midnight called 120 Minutes, which played videos from, like I said, like all the like indie rock bands and shoegaze bands, and like Sonic Youth and The Cure and The Smiths and all these bands that I would have probably never otherwise heard unless I lived in like a college town. But we could get a really faint college radio station that would come in from Indianapolis if that was like 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. And I remember tuning into that station and just, you'd fish around the dial and you'd get it. And they would play a lot of like cool, weird, indie and alt rock records. And that was a big gateway for a lot of really awesome, obscure music. I mail order a lot, and that was an outlet. But ultimately, I remember being a kid, and my first show was Metallica on Injustice for All album. And I remember, I would see Cliff Burton wearing Misfits shirts in like the mid 80s. And I would be like, yeah, what's this band he's always wearing? So there were these gateways for everyone. Or like, I remember my mom went to this small indie video store we had in town, and she brought home the VHS of Rock and Roll High School when I was like 11. She's like, "Oh, this looks like something you would be into." And it's strange. And then I remember watching, there was a program on USA Network called Night Flight, which played a lot of weird, they sometimes played punk documentaries, like they played The Decline of the Western Civilization and like Another State of Mind, which had like, Minor Threat and outlets where you could occasionally get a glimpse into this world of like alternative culture. But ultimately, even for me, that I had that thing too, where I needed, that major label thing brought that music to my little town and how isolated it was. And people forget that there was a time before we could just click a button and discover some obscure band in the middle of like Poland.
Yeah.
It's so surreal, but we're almost desensitized to it now, and we're like, whatever. But back then, it was like, holy shit, I discovered this weird compilation with like, 20 bands from all around the world speaking all these languages that sound alien to me at, 11 years old, and it's so cool. But I still nerd out on that stuff though. But I think some people, at least probably the younger generation, I think it's just normal to them. Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. The discovery, the method has changed. I always still love when like the thrill still happens though. Like the last few years, I did like a deep dive into like Japan's pop punk scene, which has some very cool stuff.
Yeah.
So like having that same kind of rush is still it's different from when I was a kid, but the thrill is still the same. One thing I wanted to ask you about, one of my favorite songs on So Long a Story, just about like what you could tell me about the writing and production of the song. What can you tell me about the writing of Takeoffs and Landings? Do you remember writing that song?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, honestly, like talking about the writing of songs is kind of like my favorite thing. It's always
nice.
I like telling stories and like kind of giving, as a listener too. Like I know Kris from listen, Jake, nice guy, and he does a podcast where they dissect one song for an artist every podcast. And I remember, I've listened to a few. I listened to that he did, and it's always cool. Like Brett from Bad Religion broke down Stranger Than Fiction. And there's a lot of really good literary references in there, but there were a few things where I'm like, wow, I never would have picked that up. And so as a writer, I'm always really happy to talk about it. But Takeoffs and Landings, that was one where I probably was just prior to writing most of the songs for So Long Astoria, or it was during that period of time. So it's probably 2002 when I was working on that. One night I drove out to LAX airport in Los Angeles, and I set up top the parking structure in my car, and I had this, I had a radio that looked like this. Oh, I have a couple of them, but like, I like old 60s, like, chunky radios that have like airline bands and police band. You could, this one was a battery one, and I, set up there and I listened to the conversations between the control tower and the planes taking off and landing. And I just, just sat there and I looked out over the like sea of lights and the planes taking off. And I just wrote about this. Like, I'm a very, very stream of consciousness writer. I like to sit and write my surroundings and what I'm seeing. And like, there's this quote by Tom Waits I love. It just basically says, like, to an extent about, just looking at like my room here now, I would just try to pick out everything and then just try to tell each item and thing I'm seeing in the most vivid, descriptive way possible. And that's kind of just what that song was. It was just a lot of visual imagery. There were some other little things tied in there, like a couple people that I, kind of was talking to at the time, and like little things. But it was. I think it was kind of secondary to all of the other things that were in it. I like just deep diving in a couple lines in the song. One time around that time, I flew back from Australia on my birthday, and we took off on January 12th, and then we crossed the date line, and we arrived on January 12th, and everyone would joke like that was the year I aged twice and had 2 birthdays. And so I kind of like, that was my thought of the Dateline, international Dateline thing. And then, and of course, I just wanted to write some of the imagery of like, the planes, like the, fasten seatbelt sign, and, how sometimes we sit there waiting for that. There's like, in the movie Say Anything, like that was the whole part of that movie where at the last scene in the movie where John Cusack and Ione Skye, I think she's never flown before, so they fly together, and he's trying to tell her that when the fasten seatbelt sign goes off, that everything will be okay, and you can relax. And so the movie ends with the fasten seatbelt sign going off, and that's how it ends. So that was kind of that. There's just that's kind of the gist of it. I think the funny thing about that song is how many people still to this day that are like plane enthusiasts or pilots will be like, hey, I love that song, but the runway lights aren't blue. I'm like, I know, but it just creative license with that one because, I think runway lights are white, and the runway lights are the deepest white, like the color, it just didn't work. Sometimes you've got to take that creative license and just make it something else. But I mean, there were blue lights, but technically, yes, I know this, but I love that people say that. It's funny to me.
Oh, I love that. I love that people do that. Yeah, it would be a different cadence. Like,
Totally.
The romantic part of the eyes is not the white part.
No,
it's the
sounds pretty weird. Like, hey, I like the whites of your eyes. It's really fucked up.
Yeah, that's like some serial killer talk. Do you remember like what amps you were using on that album? Because I thought the guitar tones you got on So Long Astoria, there's a certain sort of like crispness to them.
Thanks.
They're not like your typical like distorted, like fuzzed out kind of guitars. They almost sound clean.
I'm not a big fan of 90s and 2000s like punk rock tones. This is not my thing. Like I said, I really love like indie and alt rock stuff and more vintage sounds. So when we recorded So Long Astoria, my whole thing was we have a bigger budget, so I really want to use different tones on everything to really give every song its own thing. But not just for the sake of doing it. It needs to fit the feeling of what I want the song to feel like. So mostly on most of the records, I generally use like a 1960s era Fender Bassman, but I used a few like kind of special sounds. Like I bought this this Matchless Chieftain amp that I use is like most of the sound of one guitar, an unopened letter to the world. And then the second guitar, like usually if I'm doing like a jazz master with one track, I'll do like a Telecaster or like some sort of Les Paul with P90s on the other one. Usually middle pickup a lot of the time. My Telecaster is permanently a middle pickup. I don't use the heavy distorted pickup, and I usually use my amp. My amp gain is my main tone, and I use a 1979 Orange OR80 that has a master volume, and because some of them don't, so that means you have to turn it up to 10 to get it to break up and give you gain.
Yeah.
But this one has a master. But that's my main amp, but I don't think I use that so much in the studio. Usually, most of the studios we go to, I generally try to record at places that spend old amps and things. Like the other day, Pet Sounds album, and I got to go and see the studio where that was recorded, and it just blew my mind. But I love all those old studios, and at the time, you could still get a budget to go in and record it. Places that would have all this history and these you can get great sounds anywhere. But my whole thing though is like, actually miking amplifiers and getting great room sounds and not using Pro Tools or Auto-Tune as much as you can, and not using Auto-Tune at all, but using like Pro Tools. I think you can use it as like a tool to record, and you can use it as a tool to manipulate. I think bands that do both fine, but for me, it's about going in and capturing something that's real and honest and organic. And because you listen to my favorite Stones albums or the favorite Beatles albums, you can hear the mistakes, and that's genuinely what makes it one of the reasons. But anyway, that big thing for me I love is making sure that that each song kind of has its own sound. Because I think a lot of those records that we would kind of get lumped in with at the time, I would always find that for me, it would always sound like every song had the same blown out guitar plugged into like a really distorted amp, and there was no variation between the songs. And that really, I really wanted to have peaks and valleys, and every song kind of have its own feeling. That was it. I give long-winded answers. My apologies.
Oh, it's all good. This stuff is fascinating to me as somebody who's just in their apartment with their amp Sims and Easy Drummer.
Yeah, but sometimes you can make cool stuff like that. Like David Bazan from Pedro the Lion. He's a really amazing engineer, and he does a lot of stuff that's like, electronic drums created and stuff. But he does it in a way I think it's really genuinely cool. And so yeah, it just depends. But I don't know. I think I just come from that different thought process. But that's what makes everyone's creative process unique and important, is because everyone does. If we all did it the same way, then we just have a bunch of clones of each other, and I don't want that. I like to have records that make me annoyed, and I like to have records that make me go, wow, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. Makes me want to quit, and it makes you want to go back to the drawing board and try to write again. Because I think if you get kind of bored with music, sometimes you'll get in these ruts where you're like, but then sometimes I'll hear a record where I'll be like, man, that set such a high bar, and how does somebody write a song with that kind of depth and feeling, and it just makes you just crushes you. That still does that to me sometimes. It's harder as you get older and your ear gets more jaded, but it still happens, and when it does, you can't ignore it. You've got to run and pick up your guitar and use that inspiration.
Oh, certainly, and especially given I imagine that I think that applies even more so now, given the two bats with COVID and the state of the world the last few years, for sure. You kind of just have to grab for things. Yeah, it's been harder to write in the last couple of years because like I said, I tend to write more when I'm out traveling. But I think I would go on little road trips by myself, just with my dog. During the pandemic, starting March 2020, I kind of lived in 4 or 5 places. Without saying too much, I like I said, I left for tour in March 2020. I went to Indiana, visited my mom, and then I was at the time I was living back on the West Coast, and I was married. And then because of all of the weight of everything in the world, my relationship suffered that, and we ended up separating. And so that coupled with the sickness and stuff. This was a lot on my plate. So I think as a writer, it really, in a normal situation where I think I would have had an outlet of going out and hanging out with friends and going to shows and doing things that kind of kept my mind off all that. I think that,
it definitely gave me a lot of depression and things, and it kind of stunted me from writing or creating. But once I kind of like, I'm a firm believer of like, advocating for mental health, and and if you're feeling down, like I downloaded some meditation apps, and I did some online therapy again, and and all those things helped, and tried to connect with friends via FaceTime and Zoom and all that stuff, and I dug myself out of it. But I mean, definitely this shit is real, and it's not good. It's good for the creative process if you can harness that sadness or pain or struggle and write about it. But I think it's taken me a lot of like cathartic healing before I could get back and be like, okay, now I've kind of healed from a lot of that, so I really want to write about it and write. But then you got to kind of how do I put myself back in what I was feeling? Sometimes you can't get back there. It's hard for me to maybe it's just I'm old and I can't remember as well. But sometimes it's hard to be like, all right, how was I feeling that moment? I write better in the moment if I can do it. In that moment, I think it was just too much. At that moment, I was just trying to survive. But I'm here, and I did. And I'm definitely writing a lot. And I've written a lot over the last several years. Everyone's always like, hey, when are you doing a new record? And I think they don't realize, as just a human that just does normal people stuff, I'm always writing. It's just a matter of sometimes I'll write half a song and I'll be like, oh, I'll get back to it. Sometimes I'll write a whole song, but you never record it. Sometimes it's time. That hasn't been the case. I have all the time in the world now, but sometimes it's okay, well, how do I make money to go in and pay for this? Because going in a studio,
right?
Usually, if you look at the Descendants studio, the Blasting Room, or something comparable, the average studio like that's probably going to be around $500 or $600 a day. If you're paying that out of pocket, you're going to record for 2 weeks. For me, that's a lot of money. I got to pay rent and bills like anyone else. And if I'm not touring, that's how I make my living. So these are all reasons why you just get several years on. You're like, okay, I haven't recorded, but I have over 200 or more song ideas that are in various stages of being completed. It's just a matter of honing down and being all right, can I really focus on 15 of these that I feel I can, because there's a lot of great songs, and I know I have well more than that will make a record, but it's just a matter of my brain. Sometimes we're our own worst enemy, I guess, but it will happen. There are a lot of really cool things in motion that I can't talk about that we're planning. The Song Astoria album 20th anniversary, God help us all, is next year, and have some really big things planned for that. But because of certain circumstances, we probably won't be able to do it till 2024. But planning some big things around that, and hoping for some new music around that as well. So yeah.
I was so happy when All Souls Day and Graveyard of the Atlantic finally came out. I was like, oh, this is great. A little just taste, because I hadn't had anything new since Welcome to the Night. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I was going to ask if there were plans for a new full length eventually. And yeah, the practicalities of creating music nowadays, but I'm glad that the inspiration is there, Kris, and the love of music is there.
Oh yeah, that never goes away. It just varies from time to time. Certain times, it's like anything, whatever your passion may be. It's sometimes, I have friends who are artists that write, they draw or paint, and sometimes they would get inspired and they would paint, and sometimes they would go a year without painting. Same with me. Sometimes sitting around at home, I won't pick up a guitar at all, but then I'll go on a drive for or a trip somewhere, when I would do that. And immediately when I'm just looking at surroundings and seeing a different environment, that makes all the difference. And suddenly I'm just dictating just notes of lyrical ideas into my phone. So yeah, sometimes just changing it up. Sometimes picking up a different guitar. A lot of guitarists, I've always heard this thing about, you can only get so many songs out of one guitar, because the feeling of, you pick up a different, or an amp. Sometimes if I play on my acoustic guitar, I'm going to pick it up and gravitate towards writing a certain way. Generally, we'll write more folky country chords in the open fret position. But then, if I pick up my Telecaster, I'm generally going to play, in my mind, my hands go and do different things. If I'm plugged into an amp, same thing. I might, if I have all my droney pedals, I'm going to do different stuff. So yeah, you just use the tools you have and try to get out of your comfort zone. That's the hard part for me, because I'm a very creature of habit, and I tend to get myself into a pattern, and it's breaking that pattern. And when I do, there are good rewards from that, for sure. It's hard to hear yourself say that because you know it's true, but then you're like, okay, I got to do that more.
Yeah. And then just being like open to like your different influences, like because I feel like your interpretation on your different influences is going to create something like different, but still uniquely you, for sure.
That I agree. That's why I always feel like maybe there's a band that starts out and I kind of feel like their early albums are kind of like generic or like derivative of other things. But I always find when some of those bands grow up and start discovering like a wider, more broad palette of music, then I hear it in their songs like tenfold. Like, I mean, I don't know really good examples, but like, this is not a disrespect. This is a compliment. Like, I never really listened to the band Title Fight. The first few records, to me, it kind of sounded like Lifetime or something. And then their last few records they're really great records. And I went out on Warped Tour one year when they were on it, and we became friends. And we all loved the same bands. I could hear in their songs that like they were big fans of Quicksand and Jawbreaker and some of the Dinosaur Jr. Some of the more dreamy, moody stuff I love. And we just nerded out on all this music. And same with a lot of bands that like kind of, like I said, they start out taking one path. Like I listened to our first record and I just hear like all these like really kind of 90s Ramonesy power pop bands, like the like the Queers and the Mr. T Experience and the Screeching Weasel, and then of course the Lookout bands like the first two Green Day albums. And I hear all those things in a good way, but it's definitely to me that's one of my favorite records I've done, because it was like the whole first 19 years of my life compacted into one package. But it's also to me, it sounds like this young human that is still discovering life and has so much more to come. And I think that's one thing that I'm proud of with the Ataris. If I could say one positive thing about songs I've done in our albums, there's certain albums I really just, I don't sit around and listen to our songs. But if I were to tell somebody, hey, check out our band, I think So Long Astoria is an album that I really feel as a whole package. I'm proud of it. I think that it turned out how I wanted. I feel when we play those songs live now, they feel so much larger and they have so much more room to breathe because they're road tested and we played them so many times now. Whereas when we recorded them, like I said, I show the parts to the band, to the drummer, and then I would go in and record most of the other instruments. So they basically were born as songs in the studio, and maybe a couple of them we played before the album was recorded, but when a song really has a chance to evolve on the road, you can always hear that in the music. At least for me, I can, with my own songs. So, that helps. But it's generally not like that with this band. It's generally always the songs are recorded and then we play them on the road. It's kind of backwards. Everything's backwards in the Ataris.
Well, it's working. It's been working, and it's worked for me as a fan for a really long time. Well, I can't wait to see what you put out next, Kris. And so I want to make sure we get all our plugs here. So you're opening on the Trident 2 tour with Lit, Alien Ant Farm, and Hoobastank. And is there anything else we can plug?
I think we're about to lock in something really big for overseas. Just 2 shows in somewhere in the. I can't really say yet because I want to jinx it, but that'll be something I'll be announcing soon if it happens. But I probably in the next week I'll know if it locks in. But I don't know how many listeners you have from this region anyway. It's strangely for the Ataris, there are these odd pockets of the world where we're bigger than anywhere else in like the States or like Europe. It's like, and there's a couple places in like in Asia where the Ataris, for some reason, I've kind of figured out that it's because when the internet kind of broke in these countries, kids that were listening to music suddenly discovered music on the internet, and they, in a sheltered place that was kind of like cut off from the rest of that pop culture, and so because of that, the Ataris became their band, and we were like, it's basically like punk rock started in the early 2000s for them because that's when they, like that generation discovered that music, which is really cool and weird to me because, we'll go to in the States, we'll play for maybe 800 people on average. And then there are certain pockets of the world where, we'll play for like 5 times that. And that's really weird, but it's cool. But anyway, so one of those places, we're trying to work out 2 shows that are going to be really massive and will be fun. And hopefully we do it safely and it proves that we can still try to do some more things. And then we'll try to dip the toes back in and hopefully definitely some shows in 2024, some really special things. And I don't know about next year, probably just focusing on recording. So, yeah.
Well, excellent. When this stuff is announced, you'll have to come back and we can talk about it then. I would love that, Kris.
Yeah, anytime. I'm honored. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. This has been a delight. Thank you, Kris.
Yeah, have a great day. Take care.
I will never not be excited to get to chat with folks whose work I've admired for so long. I'm so glad that Kris is well. He's on the other side of his bouts with COVID, and he's continuously inspired and is getting back out on the road in a way that he feels comfortable with. So, folks, tickets for the Tried and True tour are on sale now. It kicks off October 14th in Nashville, Tennessee, and concludes November 3rd in Cypress, Texas. And that is Kris Roe of the Ataris, along with Alien Ant Farm, and then your co-headliners Lit and Hoobastank. Should be a super fun tour. So tickets are on sale now. So for Tried and True Tour 2022. So get those while you can. And thank you, Kris, for your time and candor. It was a true delight to get to chat with you. I also owe a huge debt of gratitude and a huge shout out to Chris Fafelios of the band Punchline, who also co-owns a podcasting service called We Know Podcasting. I had some technical issues during the recording of this episode, and Chris was able to help me out and get the episode edited and sounding amazing. And I'm very grateful for his work. If you are a podcaster, need any work launching a podcast, starting a podcast, go to weknowpodcasting.com. Those guys know their stuff and they can really help you out. And I'm tremendously appreciative of the assistance on this episode. And if you guys enjoyed this, if you're an Ataris fan who's listening to this for the first time, I tremendously appreciate you taking a chance on a new podcast. If you are enjoyed this and think you know a friend who would be interested in the show as well, or if you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can go to awesomedisaster.com. That's got links to everywhere you can get the show. We are on Apple, Stitcher, and Spotify. I've interviewed folks from bands in Hit the Lights, the comedian Tom Rhodes, the comedian Glenn Wool, Jarrett Reddick from Bowling for Soup, Mitch Allen from SR71. I've had some great conversations on this show. So you can find everything at awesomedisaster.com and continue to be excellent to one another. And I will see you next time between Awesome and Disaster. Stay safe, wear a mask, get vaxxed and boosted, and stomp out fascism. Take care, everybody.